All right, today we're jumping into one of the deepest mysteries out there, consciousness. But here's the twist. What if we've all been asking the wrong question about it for, like, centuries? What if the real problem isn't finding the answer, but realizing we've been stuck on the wrong question all along?
So let's just stop for a second and think about this. The philosopher David Chalmers has this great way of putting it. Right now, you have a movie playing inside your head. And it's not just any movie, right? It's got 3D vision, surround sound, you've got emotions, memories, that constant inner narrator, the whole shebang. That inner movie, that's your consciousness. It's the most real thing you'll ever know. But why? Why is it there at all? I mean, why aren't we just, fleshy robots processing data without any of this inner experience?
And that one little question, why, is exactly where modern science just slams into a brick wall. It's a puzzle so deep it's actually got its own name, the hard problem.
Okay, to really get this, we've got to split the problem in two. First, you've got what scientists call the easy problems. And look, they're not easy. This is some seriously complex neuroscience, but they are, in theory, solvable. We can figure out how we walk or talk. We can stick you in an fMRI and see which brain areas light up when you see your best friend's face. We can explain the function of what's going on. But then, there's the hard problem. Why does all that electrical and chemical fizzing in your brain feel like something from the inside? Why is there an actual experience of seeing that face or feeling that pain?
And here's the thing. Our standard scientific playbook just breaks. It completely falls apart. We're fantastic at explaining how things work. How one thing emerges from another, like how a bunch of individual cars create a traffic jam. But explaining the function of the brain, it doesn't get us 1 inch closer to explaining the feeling. It's like a ladder that's missing the final, most important rung.
So when you hit a wall this big, it forces you to think way, way outside the box. And that's exactly what's happened. Scientists and philosophers have started exploring some pretty wild and radical ideas. Basically, everyone's split into two big camps. In one corner, you've got people like the philosopher Dan Dennett. Their take? The hard problem is a big mistake. That inner movie you think you have? It's an illusion, a trick of the mind. If we just explain all the functions of the brain, we're done. Problem solved. But in the other corner, you have thinkers like David Chalmers, who say, whoa, not so fast. Maybe the reason we can't explain consciousness using physics is because consciousness itself is a fundamental piece of physics, just like space or time or mass.
And that second idea, well, it leads to this really mind-bending concept called panpsychism. Pan meaning all, psyche meaning mind. It's the idea that consciousness isn't some weird fluke that only happen in complex brains like ours. Nope, it's a fundamental feature of reality, woven into the fabric of the universe. Meaning, some tiny basic form of it could be in everything.
Now hold on, before you imagine rocks having existential crises, it's really important to get what this means. As David Chalmers hilariously puts it, it's not that a photon is racked with angst. It's not thinking or worrying. The idea is way more subtle. It's that a photon might have some incredibly simple, raw proto-feeling, like a single pixel of the complex movie we experience in our head.
Okay, so those are two pretty wild attempts to find an answer. But now, let's pivot. Because what if the entire problem isn't with the answer? What if it's the question we've been asking this whole time that's been leading us astray?
Think about how science usually works. It asks, what produces this? It's always looking for a cause that creates an effect. It's on a hunt for the machine, the specific part of the brain, the one process that's acting like a factory, churning out this thing called consciousness.
But now, let's look at a completely different angle, one that comes from Buddhist thought. The question gets a total makeover. It's not what produces consciousness. Instead, it's under what conditions does consciousness arise. See the shift? It's no longer a hunt for a cause. It's an investigation into a set of conditions. And that little change in wording is a massive shift in perspective. You stop searching for some magic consciousness stuff or a little engine in the brain that makes it all happen. Instead, you start just observing it as a process, a dynamic, ever-changing pattern that shows up when the conditions are right and vanishes when they're not. So from this point of view, that inner movie we talked about, it's not one solid thing. It's actually a super fast mashup of 5 different processes happening all at once. You've got form, which is just your body and senses taking in data. Then there's feeling, that raw instant hit of like, dislike, or meh. After that comes perception, where your brain slaps a label on it. Oh, that's a tree. That's a loud noise. Then you've got formations, which are all your reactions, your habits, your biases kicking in. And finally, there's consciousness itself, just the basic faculty of knowing that all this is happening. The real trick, the illusion, is that these 5 things are moving so fast, they look like one smooth, continuous film.
Okay, to really nail down this difference between looking for a thing versus observing a process, we need a good analogy. And this one is perfect. All right, picture this. Science's search for the source of consciousness. It's like a scientist standing by a river, staring intently at a whirlpool. And they're obsessed. They're trying to find the one specific drop of water that causes the whole thing to happen.
They're convinced that if they could just capture it, they'd find a special whirlpool molecule. They think that if they can just isolate that, they'll finally understand what a whirlpool is. The whole search is based on one assumption. The whirlpool must be a thing made of some special stuff.
But what if that whole approach is just wrong? The Buddhist perspective suggests the breakthrough doesn't come from looking closer and closer at the water. It comes from stepping back and realizing the whirlpool isn't a thing at all. It's a temporary pattern. It's a process that only exists because of a set of conditions: the speed of the water, the shape of the riverbed, a rock that's in just the right spot. There is no whirlpool molecule to find. The real problem isn't explaining the whirlpool. It's the feeling that you should be able to reach in and grab a solid center that was never even there.
So, okay, a whirlpool, a molecule. Why does any of this matter? Why is changing the question so important? Well, it all comes down to the goal behind each question.
When science asks its question, its goal is to explain how matter somehow creates mind. It's focused on causes and mechanisms, and that leads it right into the brick wall of the hard problem. But the Buddhist question has a completely different endgame. The goal isn't just to explain experience, it's to understand its conditions so that we can suffer less. See, from that perspective, the problem isn't that experience exists. The problem is that we mistake this constantly changing whirlpool for a solid, permanent self that we have to protect and defend.
And that, right there, is the big idea. This deadlock we've been in over consciousness for so long, maybe it's not a scientific failure at all. Maybe it's just been a failure of imagination in how we frame the question. Because sometimes the biggest leap forward doesn't come from finding a shiny new answer. It comes from finally landing on a much, much better question. So I'll leave you with this to chew on. If a problem this huge, this fundamental, can be completely transformed just by changing the question, what other unsolvable problems, maybe in science or maybe even in your own life, are you stuck on? Not because they're impossible, but just because you've been asking the wrong question all along.